Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm very excited to have with me today Dr. Kevin Stock, one of my favorites in the carnivore space right now. I know that you've got a huge year ahead. You've been pumping out crazy good content, getting some big bangers out there, and super excited to have you here, my man.
Hey, I'm excited to chat.
Excellent, excellent. Why don't we start with your backstory? I know that you had an interesting childhood that has led you to where you are today. So give us an overview of where you started and how it got you to where you are now.
Yeah, I'll keep it as brief as possible for a little context. But yeah, I was an overweight kid, and I remember a long time ago that there was like kind of an overwhelming obsession. And by, junior high, I mean, I'm talking like 12, 13 years old, I was doing weird diets, really obsessed about we say health and fitness, but it's really just fitness throughout high school, trying to figure that out and college. And I kind of got a handle of the fitness piece after 10, 15 years or so. I did some physique competitions when I was in dental school, and I would say over the last decade or so, I've added in the health and fitness, like the health part of the health and fitness. And that was because I wasn't feeling great, even though I had like the body. I was happy with my body, but I wasn't feeling great. So I kind of just continued my journey in the nutrition space, especially where most of my I would say interest lies, and to kind of figure out like how can I look good and feel good. And so that's kind of in the last 10 years or so. So that's a very high level overview, I'd say.
It's very interesting to me how people tend to forget one or the other. It's like they think that they can exercise their way out of not feeling great, and it is possible to build a good body, but you feel like shit inside. So you had some experience with that, it sounds like. So one of the main messages that you push out is that diet is extremely important, and the world is not looking at diet correctly right now. Could you give us maybe an overview of where the world is right now in terms of what the typical diet is and what you think is wrong with that from a high level? And we'll dive deeper into the specifics later.
Sure. Well, I think what you said really kind of lead into this is really important, is that people tend to forget one or the other. So kind of in the health space, there's I'll say a fraction of people that say, all we need to really focus on is body composition. And so what kind of diet can we eat that's going to help you lose fat? And I don't want to say that's totally wrong, because it's not. A lot of people have health problems because they are overweight and have metabolic dysfunction. And so when you do get a healthier body composition, health benefits come with that, absolutely. But on the flip side, there are so many people. I use my dad as a common example because he's 5'11", he's 160 pounds, he works out every day, he golfs every day, but he's had every health ailment you can imagine. And so it's like he's not had any issues with body composition ever, but he's had all the other issues. So it really, health and fitness really is it's a two-sided coin, and sometimes often people focus on just the fitness side of the coin, like, and I mean, I guess on the other side, you might have some people who are like, hey, I'm just focusing on feeling good and I'm healthy. I think an example of that would be like DJ Khaled. I use him for some examples because like clearly doesn't have a very good body composition, but seems to have lots of energy and that's all he cares about. But I do think in order to be healthy, you can't be like obese is like by definition not a healthy state. And so there you do need to have some body composition in the health and fitness coin. So I'm glad you touched on that. Regarding the question you're asking, like what's the state of like the world nutrition? It obviously depends where you are and things like that. For example, one of the questions that you mentioned we might talk about today is like, what's the world eating? And the world's eating a plant-based diet. And what does that mean? Well, over 50% of the world's calories come from wheat, corn, and rice. And then if you throw in sugar and soy into that, basically these five plant ingredients, that's the majority of people's calorie consumption. And so the world is on a plant-based diet. All those are plant-based foods, plant-based derivatives. So like when we say wheat, you get in corn, you have a million derivative products out of these original plant food products. And so the world is on a plant-based diet. And for the last 70 plus years, the health world has demonized meat, specifically red meat and saturated fat. And we've been eating less and less, and we're getting sicker and sicker and fatter. So the inverse correlation between red meat consumption and obesity it's an inverse correlation. So to say like something like red meat's causing diabetes or it's causing obesity is just nonsensical.
Yeah, and when some people hear the words plant-based, they think that we're talking about vegan automatically, but that isn't necessarily the case
Sure.
because I know that when I was growing up, and maybe you were the same, I had a pretty typical American diet of cereal for breakfast with some soy milk because dairy is bad, and had a little bit of meat here and there, but it was like a special treat. And it was usually like chicken breast or, some low fat kind because fat
Yeah.
demonization was extremely permeated by that point. And I'm assuming you're a millennial. You look like you're in your 30s. I'm in
Yep.
my late 20s. We both had a similar upbringing where the plants are the basis of the meal most of the time. Like the majority of the plate was either salad or whole grains or fruits or vegetables. So that is plant based,
Yep.
I would say. And like you said, a lot of things are like secretly plant based, and people don't really think of it as a plant. But if
Right.
I get a piece of candy, that's sugar that comes from a plant. Basically everything processed, vegetable oils that comes from a plant. Um, all the grains and the piece of bread, that's a plant. Like people just need to think back where they need to trace it back to where it came from. It's almost always plants, like everything that you see people eating these days.
Yep.
So I think that's a good point to just start discussing. Like, okay, so the whole world is definitely on a plant-based diet, and you said it depends on where you are. I travel quite a lot. I've been in several states in the USA, Mexico, and Colombia in the last 6 months, and everywhere I go, I see just potato chips, people eating bread, empanadas, burritos, tacos.
Hmm.
It's the same thing. Like it's this is happening around the world. I would say the USA is a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of eating garbage, but everyone's catching up.
Yeah.
So, where do we go from here? Like, how do we, or I guess we should first dive in a little bit. Why is meat important? Like, why most people have a little bit of meat here and there. Not everyone's vegan, but they think it's bad. They,
Hmm.
they, they feel a little bit bad eating it because it has a lot of fat, like we've heard. So, what's important about meat? Why should people not be scared of it?
Yeah. And to touch on a little bit what you're
And red
talking
meat specifically, like you said.
about,
Hmm.
like, because I said location, dependent on location, because we see various trends in certain locations. And to broadly speak, like in India, they for a long time and now, like, they eat vegetarian. They focus on very much plant-based diet in India, and they have some of the highest rates of diabetes and a very like unhealthy statistically. Whereas we also have a place like Hong Kong where they eat the most meat in the world per capita, and they also have the longest life expectancy. And not that these are causative like relationships, but these are correlation relationships that people need to like I think are worth looking at. So why is meat important? Well, we have to eat to survive, and so when we're eating, we want to eat like we need to get nutrition. We need to get vitamins. We need to get minerals. We need to get macronutrients. We need to get micronutrients, and ideally, we get this energy, this nutrition with the least amount of harm. And humans, like every species on the planet, tends to have a natural species appropriate diet. And I think where we've really gone wrong is like, what should humans like as a species? We shouldn't, some of us be eating herbivore, just plants, and some of us shouldn't be eating only meat. Like, we are all far more similar than we are different. We have small differences in genetics and things like that, but they're far smaller than the vast amount that we have in common. And so we should all be eating a relatively similar diet. And sure, there can be some variation based on small genetic variations. We could talk about like lactose intolerance and things like that. So there's like variations to take into consideration, but we're all far more similar. We should be eating a similar diet. And I would argue that even with like the world has decided that that's a plant-based diet, I would argue that is incorrect. We should be eating a meat-based diet. I would say anatomically, physiologically, we are meat-based eaters, and I would actually classify us as like we are omnivores. But most people don't know this. Omnivores tend to specialize in eating plants, or they specialize in eating animals. And I would argue humans are omnivores that specialize in eating animals, and that's known as a hypercarnivore. And a hypercarnivore is defined as they eat 70+% of their diet from animal products. And they have these fallback foods, things like fruits and roots, that opportunistic fallback foods that might make up to 30% of their diet or so. So I would argue that is a proper human diet. But I think the world has that, flipped backwards.
Yeah. And the place that I actually found you was Dr. Anthony Chafee's podcast, and
Mhm.
he talks about this a lot. He might even disagree with you a little bit there. He says like we're straight up carnivores because meat is, what humans have been eating for our entire existence for millions of years, and plants were like a starvation food. Like if you weren't able to get that hunt successfully, if you weren't able to take down that mammoth and bring it back to your tribe, then you guys were like you had to eat plants to get some nutrients, like you said. But the question then is what's the downside of those plants? And I know that this mantra has been all over the place in the carnivore world. The plants are trying to kill you. Another one from Dr. Chafee. I believe he started that one.
Yep.
Could you provide a little elaboration on why that this like plants are trying to kill you meme is not just a meme? It's real.
Sure. So a few things, and I love Dr. Chafee. We got to hang out a bunch, like down in Texas last year. So, anyways, good friend. So a few things. One is humans undoubtedly throughout our history had times where we survived on only meat, undoubtedly. And there was times where this is again based on time and location where we undoubtedly included plants in the diet. And I can talk about that from an oral health perspective and anthropologic perspective where we can look at microwear on teeth and we can determine like what like were they eating plants, and we can determine like various other things like salivary amylase. There's a good amount of evidence that we have eaten plants in our ancestral past. We can look at plant polyliths that get stuck in dental calculus. We can talk all about these things. So I would actually, maybe Chafee and I would disagree a little bit. I would say we undoubtedly ate plants throughout our evolutionary history, but there are places that we definitely went without eating plants. So we don't need to eat plants. And so I just want to clarify that. I do think, like I said, we're meat-based species. And I would say regarding the plants are trying to kill you, I would actually maybe push back a little bit there, meaning I would probably clarify it and say plants are trying to defend themselves, meaning just like every other living thing, kind of the goal is survival and reproduction. And plants can't run away. They can't fight back like physically. Well, actually, I should take that back. They do actually kind of fight back physically in various mechanisms. Like if you've ever picked up a plant with a thorn or you've gotten poison ivy, they have a kind of physical means of defense as well. But one of their main means of defense is chemical warfare, meaning like they have these phytotoxins within them. You eat them, or the animal eats them, or with any predator, it makes them sick. It impairs digestion. It can kill various things like fungi and bacteria. So plants do defend themselves. And so something that throughout, I'll say, modern culture, we have assumed like plant foods they do no harm. They're all good. They're all healthy. But I mean, we intuitively know that's not true, meaning like you wouldn't go out in your backyard and just start eating off the tree or eating grass off the lawn. Why? Because we are not designed to eat those kinds of foods. And so even many of the foods that we do eat that we can eat and we can assimilate some nutrition and some energy from, they come with some potential consequences.
Yeah, and that's so important because everyone just naturally knows. I'm looking right now in my backyard. There's a tree covered in these beautiful red berries, and I know intuitively, and even the most plant-based proponents out there know intuitively, you should not just go out in nature and just eat the beautiful-looking things,
Right.
or it will either give you a very bad time or kill you.
Right.
And when you contrast that with the vegetables they say are amazing and giving you great health and fantastic, they're really like 99.99% the same. Like the spinach bag at the store is not that different from the fern in my backyard. They're mostly the same. There's different variations of them, honestly, but the ones that people are eating right now that they think are good, they are only really edible because we've put them through a crazy thousands of years process of selective breeding and bioengineering. And that's one of the things you talked about. And I actually listened to a little bit of your podcast that you have, and how the agricultural revolution was an extremely pivotal point in human history and human dietary history. Could you give a little bit of color to what the agricultural revolution was and how that really changed the course of how humans started eating and what happened from that?
Yeah, I love anthropology, so I could talk about this all day. So I'll try and give like a high level overview of it. But so if we were to look at time scales, 10,000 years ago was the advent of agriculture, the agricultural revolution, 10, 12,000 years ago. Before that, we were hunter gatherers, and many of the vegetables we eat today, the plant based foods we eat today, they did not exist back then. Well, they didn't even exist at the turn of the agricultural revolution. So one thing I'll mention: agricultural revolution. We'll talk about the industrial revolution and the technological revolution. I like to think in like these three kind of paradigms. So before 10,000 years ago, and just for so people kind of have a grasp on this time scale, humans, like the first humans, like Homo habilis, and that's not Homo sapien, like the first human, Homo habilis is like pretty much recognized as the first human species, use their hands as tools, things like that. And habilis means handyman. 2-3 million years ago. Then we go through like Homo erectus. We have eventually we get to Homo sapiens roughly 300,000 years ago. So from 300,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens, to 10,000 years ago, that's a long time period. Hunter gatherers, mostly I would argue, mostly hunters, fallback foods, might be some opportunistic fruits, roots, things like that. It wasn't until the agricultural revolution when we start cultivating crops, which now make up, like I was talking about, over half the world's calories from just corn, wheat, and rice. That the start of that was 10,000 years ago. And so prior to that, as far as an ancestral perspective, we didn't eat those foods, and we didn't eat things like broccoli. People was like, oh, maybe they were picking broccoli before that. No, broccoli and all the crucifers, like if you go look at what a crucifer plant actually looks like, it looks like a weed. And like you said, we specially bred that so we can create food that we can actually get some nutrition and calories out of. But it's not a natural food that you would just have found out in the wild. And so prior to 10,000 years ago, we were just eating what the biospheric buffet offered us. And if I were to drop you and like 150 of your family and friends into a savanna in Africa, and you just think about that as a thought experiment, what are you guys going to be eating? You're going to be hunting animals. That's what you're going to be doing. Sure, you might have some opportunistic eating of some plant foods, but that's the gist of what I think from a mental perspective that we're talking about. And then with the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago is when we started the cultivating crops, and we see the rise of all kinds of disease, especially in the mouth, because like teeth are, we have a hard time keeping them from one lifetime today, but they preserve for millions of years in the fossil record. So what we see 10,000 years ago is a dramatic rise in cavities and periodontal disease in the fossil record. And so that's the agricultural revolution. And then we fast forward, we get to the industrial revolution, several hundred years ago. That's when we start milling and refining these plant-based foods, and we see the rise of malocclusion. We see the rise of wisdom teeth impactions happen at this time period. And now we're in the technological revolution, where we really have seen the rise of what I call fatty tongue, which is really just obesity and metabolic dysfunction. So that's a very high level overview of kind of like the human dietary evolution.
Yeah, and one of the most important points there, I think, is that most people today, when they look at a fruit or a vegetable, they think of this like natural thing that came from the earth, and it has to be good for you because it grew out of the ground. Some people could even grow it in their own garden, and they see it right there. Like, look, I made this. I know there's no pesticides on it, so it must be good for me. But they don't take into account that those seeds themselves that exist right now to grow these things are the result of thousands of years of human manipulation. So it's not really what nature intended to have made. It was like, when you look at a tomato right now, it's like the super juicy, delicious, sweet thing versus, I forget, thousands of years ago, it was like a tiny little toxic berry. Like its ancestor was like something that you literally could not eat. But
Yep.
through, thousands of years of like selective farming, farmers selecting the sweetest, biggest, juiciest one and only letting that one procreate over time, we've created these now, like you walk into a grocery store and the produce aisle is just like full of giant, delicious, like rainbow colored foods. But if you looked at all of those things 10,000 years ago, none of them would be anything like that. They would
Yep.
be like tiny and toxic and like poison you to death if you ate it. But we actually manipulated that to not kill us immediately, but only gradually give us problems. And I think that's a good transition about the types of problems that eating these plants are giving humans, because you're a dentist, you look at people's mouths, and I think that's no one will argue that's like a very clear signal of people's health, because not only is that the place where you are literally inserting
Mhm.
and chewing these foods, so you're going to get feedback from the teeth themselves, but then you see, all these other things that happen. I know that you're versed in like helping people with sleep apnea and respiratory problems and things that happen from that as well, from fatty tongue, like you mentioned. So Could you give us a little bit of insight on what the mouth tells you about a person's health and what you've seen from your experience with different types of diets that people eat?
Yeah, so I say like the mouth is the canary in the coal mine often, meaning well, I'll first see problems in the mouth and it's evident, like your teeth are rotting. Now, I'd like to say if the certain diet is rotting your teeth, you're trying to argue that that diet is somehow healthy for systemic health. I'd say like that it raises a red flag. Like that doesn't pass the common sense test. It's rotting the hardest substance in your body, and okay, that's the one thing we have to live with. But that's going to give us a healthy body. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I think the mouth is often the canary in the coal mine where we see the early warning signs of a poor diet where they first manifest. I do pediatric dentistry, and the research shows 60 to 90% of kids have cavities, and because it's so prevalent, it's the most common disease in the world. We have normalized it. We're like, oh, kids just get cavities. It's not a normal. It's pathology. And what causes cavities? Well, fats don't cause cavities. Protein doesn't cause cavities. There's only one food that causes cavities. It's carbohydrates. So food category. So bacteria in the mouth ferment carbohydrates into acids that eat holes in your teeth. And so, I mean, that's a good indication of like maybe we're eating too much too frequently of this particular food group that is, by the way, the one non-essential macronutrient for humans. So I think from that alone we could argue that we should be eating a diet that doesn't cause cavities on its own. And if your diet, absent oral health, like brushing and flossing and things like that, were to cause cavities, I would argue you probably are not eating a species appropriate diet, because in the wild, animals rarely develop a cavity or malocclusion, but like these things have been normalized. So, I'm not sure where my train of thought was going here, but basically, the mouth is the canary in the coal mine. Like when I see problems in the mouth, including cavities, periodontal disease, about half of U.S. adults have periodontal disease. Uh, Malocclusion, even that's a hugely kind of hot, debatable topic. But malocclusion didn't exist before basically the Industrial Revolution. So to say crooked teeth and wisdom teeth impactions are just genetic, it doesn't make any sense. Genes don't change that much in a couple hundred years versus like it would take thousands and thousands of years for those kinds of genetic changes to take place. And I couldn't argue like why natural selection would select for crooked teeth and impactions. It doesn't make any sense. So that's a little bit about how, like, the mouth tells us a lot about what we should and or shouldn't be eating. And so, yeah, I would say the modern diet, it tells us we definitely should not be eating that.
Yeah. So clearly something's wrong there because we have just in the last century really made this big shift in how people eat. Before that, everyone was eating tons of meat and eggs and butter, and they're just scarfing this stuff down like raw dairy. And plants did exist, like you said, but they weren't the basis of the meal. And then, um, for anyone that's read Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, I'm not sure if you've read that one, but it goes through the whole story of how this was completely shifted away from a fat-based diet or a high-fat diet into a low-fat diet. And pretty much on a dime, there was just a 180 in the health guidelines that fat is bad for you now. Um, Everything should be low fat. Uh, Vegetable oils are fine. Processing is fine. Just plants are the best, and like having fat in your diet is bad. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's it's quite crazy how this is clearly the biggest change that humans have made in the last century, and we're clearly seeing the negative outcomes. People are super sick and unhealthy mentally and physically everywhere you go. Like I said, I travel a lot, so I always find airports the most fascinating place to just like spectate the human population because you see people from all over the world there. Just standing in line on my most recent trip coming back from Colombia, there was just a huge line of people, and I had to walk to the end of the line. So I just was like kind of walking by, just observing all these faces. And like you said, you can see that people's teeth are bad. Their faces are just drooping down. They look exhausted and stressed out, and overweight for sure, and just inflamed. I think that's the word. Just like people are just inflamed. Like their bodies are giving them all these signals that something is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's any coincidence that pretty much if you talk to anyone on the street and say, "Hey, do you think it's healthier to eat a ribeye covered in butter or a salad, pretty
Yeah.
much everyone's going to think that it's a salad because we've been so indoctrinated to think that plants are the ultimate food. So it's just very interesting. And like you said, through your practice, you get to see this in people's teeth, which is like a very clear signal.
Yep.
Um, something that I think would also be good to inject in here is a topic of bioavailability, because that's a big one. You talked earlier about how there are some nutrients in plants, but they're not the same as nutrients in meat. So could you talk a little bit about the word bioavailability, what that means in the context of different types of foods we can't eat and how we get those nutrients?
Yeah, for sure. And just to touch on what you were mentioning regarding the fat, I would argue that perhaps the number one damaging piece of advice is perhaps that saturated fat is bad and these animal fats are bad, and we need to be eating more of these polyunsaturated fats. And I think more so than anything, that is responsible for the obesity epidemic and the onslaught of subsequent health ramifications because of that: heart disease, you name it, high blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's super important to mention is like, what is quote unquote healthy fat? I think that is maybe the number one first step to reversing all these diseases is redefining what is healthy fat, and that would take us a long way. I don't think we should be eating high
And
carb.
most people will know that as seed oils. Like
Exactly.
people hear seed oils being talked about. That's what the polyunsaturated fats are.
Exactly. So the polyunsaturated fats are the omega 6, notably linoleic acid, this omega 6 fatty acid in these seed oils. I could make a strong argument for like that is like the number one problem right now. But there's other problems to get like what's the perfect diet, but I think that broad stroke is super important. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And then regarding bioavailability, this is super important. It's just kind of a couple good examples come to mind. So iron deficiency is one of the most common nutrient deficiencies in the world. So animals, when you eat a steak, you're eating heme iron. If you eat a vegetable and you read the package and it's like, oh, this has got 20% of my daily iron in it, it's non-heme iron. And the ability for the body to absorb and utilize that iron is drastically different. If the animal said it had 20% of your daily iron and the spinach said you're eating to get the same amount of iron, 20% of your daily allowance, you're going to have drastically the amount that's actually uptaken by the body. So that's bioavailability. Heme iron, far more bioavailable than non-heme iron that you get in plants. And then I think a second kind of good example is like vitamin K. So this is a fat-soluble vitamin. And there's vitamin K1, there's vitamin K2, and then vitamin K2 has various forms like MK4, MK7. But the kind like we need in our operating system is vitamin K2. And so you can eat grass, for example, and get a little bit of vitamin K1. So for one, it has very little amounts of vitamin K1, so you have to eat a lot of grass. Two, it's converted very poorly to vitamin K2, if at all, in the body. Now, if a cow eats that grass, which has a vitamin K1, the cow is going to convert that to vitamin K2 for you. And then when you eat the cow, you're going to get vitamin K2 in the form that your body can most readily use. And so that is also kind of a form of bioavailability. How well can we convert these plant nutrients? Vitamin A is another example. Different forms that there's a plant version of vitamin A and there's an animal version of vitamin A. And if we're eating the plant version, we often have to convert it into the animal version so that we can use it. And that conversion process, it differs in people, but it's often very, very poor. So those are a couple examples of bioavailability. The third thing that kind of comes to mind is plants have what we call anti-nutrients. So there's various things like phytic acid or phytic acid, which will bind minerals. So you eat it, and because we don't have the enzyme to break it down, this anti-nutrient will bind minerals that you're eating in that plant food and prevent its absorption as well. So the form of the nutrition is not the kind we need for optimal bioavailability, as well as various things in those plant foods like oxalates and phytic acid that will impair the absorption of minerals, all contribute to like plant foods overall as a whole being far less bioavailable than animal foods.
Yeah, and so in a nutshell, like plants do have certain vitamins on paper, but that doesn't mean that it's well suited for the human body to absorb.
Exactly.
And not to mention the fact that it's also filled with the defense chemicals we touched on earlier, the oxalates, the lectins, and the whole list of biological warfare that they wage to try to prevent themselves from being eaten.
Yep.
Because, to reiterate, the plants we see today have evolved for millions of years to defend themselves against things trying to eat them, or else they wouldn't survive. The plants that didn't sufficiently kill the things trying to eat them, they all died off and went extinct. The ones that exist today have been really good at warding off predators, so we should maybe question why are we eating these things? um,
Point.
and just to bring back another point that you talked about earlier, how there's this notion that you always hear from the plant-based folks, who they say every human's different. Like, we're all different. Our bodies are different, how we absorb things. And I think that's just mostly BS. I think that you can't find another animal in the wild who has different optimal diet from another animal in the same species. Like, they all eat the same thing. They have the most optimal food they're supposed to be eating. So I think that it's important to think, what is optimal for us? Like, what is the ultimate food? And when you put meat up against any plant, like, just name a single. Was there any other food in the world where you can completely live and thrive off of just one single food?
Exactly.
And even the vegans wouldn't argue that one, because they need to have like a whole shelf full of like supplements to get
Yep.
their vitamins from, because they're not bioavailable, like you said. And even though supplements themselves aren't as bioavailable as just getting it from meat, and there isn't a single fruit or vegetable you can choose that has everything you need. So they have to have tons of different things all the time to sort of nitpick their way through the vitamins that their body needs to do well. And it's pretty much impossible to do that sustainably over the long term, which is why if you talk to any, plant-based vegan who's been doing so for over 10 years, they're going to be struggling.
There's very
I'm at the age now where I knew vegans in high school and college, and the ones that are still trying to keep it up are in real rough shape,
yeah.
because they're trying to fight nature in this way.
Yeah.
And I'm all over the place here, but I think this is such an interesting point to dive into, is like the idea of being part of nature. I think that most of the vegans and this sort of spiritual side of people, like people, one that keeps coming up is people in yoga. They feel like they have to be vegan because they're like one with nature, they're one with the earth. But I would argue you are in fact going against nature, because you're eating something your body's not designed to eat. And that's basically like giving the middle finger to nature. You're saying, I'm going to do something different than what you designed me to do, and I'm just going to eat this food that I'm not designed to eat. So that's a lot of things I just threw out there. But I mean, how do you feel about that? Just the idea that eating meat is the most natural thing we can do, and this is what humans were evolved to eat.
I mean, you're right. So nature, Mother Nature, and a lot of times we get our in problems because we're trying to outsmart Mother Nature. We think we're smarter than Mother Nature, and then she strikes back. But like you mentioned, like the people doing yoga, I think it's commendable. Like they don't want to kill animals, right? But here's the thing. One is there's no diet you're eating that's not killing animals, right? Life is giving up life to sustain your life. And whether it's 2 cows a year, which someone could live on 1 cow a year, right? I probably eat 2 cows a year, just two animals. Whereas a vegan that's living on grains and things like it's not immune from animal death. To plow that field will kill far more animals every year than 2 cows. So then you have to start being like, well, what's the value of a cow's life versus the 10,000 rabbits that were killed on or whatever it is. And so I think the notion that like nature has a way and it works how it works, and when we try and work against it, it's going to work against you. And no matter what diet you eat, like living things are dying. So I some important points, I think.
Yeah, and if you ask, a one of those sort of ethically driven vegans or vegetarians, should a lion feel bad about eating that antelope? Should they really feel guilty about this? Or are they just going to do it?
Right.
And most of the time you look at that and you say, "Oh, that's just nature. That is the animal kingdom doing its thing, and that's fine." But humans people look at humans differently for some reason. Like we we've kind of gotten too smart for our own good. We're starting to question like things as basic as the things we put into our body to sustain our lives,
Yeah,
which every other animal and organism in the entire animal kingdom is doing. Um, and which is another reason why it seems like it's this detachment from nature rather than trying to get closer to nature, because we are an animal like all the rest of them,
yeah,
and we should be eating what we're naturally designed to eat. And I like the fact that there's now like guilt around that, I think is suspicious. And in my opinion, the more research I do, the more I learn that these emotional arguments being made are really profit driven by food companies who have these plant-based foods they want to sell, and they're able to squeeze out really good margins from, giving people garbage, because, they can just put it through a factory and essentially make it way cheaper and easier. It doesn't take the same work as it does to, raise cows on a farm, because that takes hard work to do.
in time.
So these business people just churn out these assembly lines that just like crank out this vegetable oil and little, patties full of chemicals that they call, Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, or whatever it is, that are just chemicals. It's just like a pile of chemicals that they call food. And
Yep.
then they use their marketing arm from all those profits they're making to make people feel bad about eating real food. Um, and it's such a mess just looking at like all the documentaries being put out on Netflix, and you know clearly emotionally driven. They have these videos of the absolute like worst of factory farming, which
Yep.
I think all of us can agree is terrible. Like some of these the practices they put animals through in these, the big meat packers are awful, and we should really get rid of that and move away from that to a more regenerative practice. And I don't know how much research you've done on regenerative agriculture, but I think that is a huge step in the right direction, where we can both bring humans back to both A, our natural diet we should be eating, which is meat, and B, bringing the production of that meat to a much more natural process, the way that nature intended it, where these cows are living extremely happy, wonderful lives, and that circle of life can continue, and where everyone's happy and everyone, the sustainability through life is just much more beautiful in that way. Would you agree?
Yeah, I get most of my food from a regenerative farm here in Missouri, and it is not. Yeah, they're not only doing well by the animals, by the land, by the planet, but it's the best nutrition I could possibly get anywhere. And so I agree that is like the way. And people really need to vote with their dollars, because I do spend more money than I would be able to pick up at a grocery store for meat. But it's like, to me, that's a priority, to support local farm, to support the earth, to support my body. And one of the things, to touch on what you were talking about earlier, is like, yeah, all animals in the wild have a natural instinct for what they need to be eating, which, like you mentioned, we lost our natural instinct of what we should be eating. And a lot of it has been more or less hijacked by, you mentioned, basically there's 10 companies that supply 80% of the food in the United States. And they are like any publicly traded company. They are profit driven, and they have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders to keep their stock price as high as possible at the expense of their consumer. And actually, like, if you think about what is their motive, it is to get cheaper and cheaper ingredients, right? Which means long shelf lives, unnatural products. They want you to be extremely palatable to addicting for repeat customers, and like, they don't have your health in their interest. Whereas your local farm, they do have the health of their animals in their interest. Like, a sick cow is not a profitable cow. And more are also putting an emphasis on the health of their land and the earth, because in the long run, that is also incentives aligned with their goal of having healthy land for their animals to live on. So I think everything like you mentioned is right on.
Yeah, and one of the points that you threw in there that I think is very important is just how what we know as food has just been so warped. And now that, the corporations have sunk their teeth into this industry, which I would argue began all the way back 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, as we discussed, how that was really when plants started to become a product, and it was a food product. And so over the years, these business people have done what, like you said, they're finding ways to squeeze profit out of these things. And now that we're in the technological revolution, we have all kinds of interesting technological ways to basically hack our way into people's taste buds and make these foods taste better to them. So, and most people don't have the time or energy to really dig into the research of the history of the diet. They just eat what tastes good. And that by doing that, they're able to get people really addicted to things that are, could just be pure chemicals. And it, this kind of takes me to one of the points I really want to touch on with you was like fruit. The topic of fruit I find interesting because for me personally, on my journey down the carnivore rabbit hole, it was pretty easy to understand, well, relatively easy to understand, like, oh shit, like maybe vegetables aren't as good as we thought, because those are typically like the leafy green salads. Those are the parts of the plant that they're the plant itself that like it obviously wants to defend itself.
Right.
It doesn't want to be eaten, so it's going to ward off predators through toxins in its leaves and its stalk and in those parts.
Yep.
But it took me a little while longer to understand the fruit side, because the argument that I had stuck in my head was fruit are these beautiful, colorful things that, they come off of the plant. And so it seems like it makes sense that those are the things we should eat. Now, I know we discussed earlier how, the ones that we see now are, kind of fake in how colorful and sweet and beautiful they are. That was one of the points that sort of pulled me back over.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the same time, I'd love to hear your argument, because you see people's teeth. And like from the podcasts I've listened to, you don't believe that eating fruit is very good because, like you're saying, that the teeth give us a lot of clues. So if someone like a fruitarian, for example, I know that people will think that that's extreme, where they eat only fruit, their teeth basically rot out of their skull. But what are your thoughts on fruit specifically in terms of how it affects people's mouths?
Right. So your intuition was not and is not far off. And so there's a few things. One is, if you think of an apple tree. So the apple tree will make this big, beautiful apple that's red, that's appealing to us and other animals. So we notice it, and it's sweet and it's juicy and it's full of laxative type stuff inside of it. So what is the purpose of all that? Well, that tree wants you to eat those seeds, transport those seeds to an area far away so you can just deposit it in dung, and it won't have to, so it can grow and not compete with the parent plant for sunlight, right? So like that is a strategy the plant uses to continue on to reproduce successfully. So that is the part of the plant that it does want us to eat. Like we said, there's a few things here. One is, a lot of the fruits today are very different than the fruits of yesteryear. You just look at bananas today, like that's a stark example, because bananas, I think, is the most bought fruit there is. It's often a loss leader in the grocery stores because everyone buys bananas. But look what like a banana in the wild looks like, full of seeds, barely edible. If you're eating it, you're not gonna like just want to eat 10 of them. So that's number one, and they're sprayed and chemically with trying to extend shelf life because that goes bad. So there's those issues. I think the main issue I actually have with fruit today is most people are already in a bad place metabolically, and I don't think eating a lot of fruit is going to help them in a metabolic way. I think if you have a healthy person that is, metabolically healthy, they're active, eating some fruit for most of these people are totally just fine, especially if it's more organic, so it's not sprayed as much, things like that. Local, seasonal stuff, I think people can do just fine with fruit. And if I'm eating a plant-based food, that's going to be one of the ones I'm going to go to before leaves and stems and flowers and things like that, which I wouldn't really ever consider eating them. So fruit actually does provide you, like, it's carbohydrate-based food, but it provides you with energy and some nutrition and vitamins that you can actually use. So in that case, I am of the plant-based foods, I am one of the biggest advocates of, if I had to eat them, it would be the fruits. And so regarding how much we should eat, if we should eat it, if someone's metabolically damaged, I think it's probably best to just limit or eliminate fruits. If you're healthy, how much fruit should you eat? I thinking of it as more of a supplementary backup, fallback dessert kind of food is the way to think about it. And like you mentioned, fruitarians, we know people that eat lots of fruit, terrible teeth. Why? Because the carbohydrates are fermented in the mouth and that produce the acids that eat holes in your teeth. And if that's all you're eating, you don't have the anti-carcinogenic foods going with it, especially. That's why if you eat a lot of meat with a piece of fruit, it's a different story than eating lots of fruit, because meat will provide a number of things that's going to help prevent the cavities, known as anti-carcinogenic food. Fruit would be a cariogenic food, but not as cariogenic as, say, sugar, like Coca-Cola. So fruit is more of one of the nuanced discussions, similar, like if we were talking about dairy. I think dairy is more of a nuanced, where people can just thrive on dairy. But I think actually a lot of people, maybe most people, are better off limiting or eliminating dairy. So apples, dairy, I think there's some decent parallels there.
Yeah, dairy is an interesting one. I know that's always sort of been controversial, like in the carnivore community as well, because it's the place that I've come to in my view of dairy as of now is milk is nature's way of getting a baby to grow and develop very quickly and get a lot of nutrients. And
Yep.
there are a few pieces of that. One of it is it contains casein, which is addictive. So it does have that addictive piece to it. And I certainly feel that, when it's just sitting in my fridge, I want it. Like I love milk. It's delicious. Like I just want to guzzle that stuff. And I also notice when I drink it, it makes my belly grow a little bit over time. Like it gives, makes me a little soft.
Yep.
After 3 months of quite strict carnivore when I was in Colombia, I came back home to visit family for the holidays, and I decided, fuck it, I'll try out some milk. I hadn't had any milk for that whole period, and for the first time in all those months, I started like getting a little bit gassy again.
Mm.
And when I was very strict, I had no gas. It like completely disappeared, and that was very interesting because I was like, okay, I've been sort of learning about like what that really is. Gas is a sign that your gut is in distress. It's saying it doesn't like what's in there. And so as soon as I brought the milk back in, it could just be a little bit of the fact that I was just having something different I hadn't had in a while. But
Were
I
you
mean, there
drinking?
were no real positive benefits from it.
Were you drinking conventional milk?
Yes, that's another great point. It was, this like glass bottle cream top, but it was pasteurized milk. So that could have been part of the reason.
So was
Don't have connections here for raw milk, so that maybe that was different as well.
there is see that's why dairy is extremely nuanced. And so if you just say, oh, don't eat dairy, it's generally a safe thing to recommend. But that means there's dairy that a lot of people could incorporate that they could do great. Like if you do raw, unpasteurized, unhomogenized A2 dairy, that is a different product than a gallon of milk you're going to go buy in the grocery store. Like, and you will probably feel and react totally different to those. So I've been this last year was the first time I incorporated milk into my diet in any capacity in my entire life, really. And so I've been doing raw, unpasteurized A2. I did goat's and cow's milk, and zero GI issues, like no problems at all. I'm not gonna say like it took me to another level or anything like that, but I've been focusing on bulking the last 18 months and putting on some weight, and I have milk played a big role in making it easier for me to do. I could always just eat more and more meat, but having some milk made it just a little easier, more enjoyable. So all that to say is like dairy is not created equal. That's to say the same thing as like there's fermented dairy, which people can really tolerate fine because it brings the lactose content way down. A2 versus A1, that's when you talk about casein, different kinds of casein proteins in the milk plays a big difference. Some people can tolerate A2, but not A1. And there's the fat, like cream and butter. People tend to do fine with that. But if you bring in the milk proteins and the lactose, the milk sugar, then they have problems. So dairy is this really nuanced discussion where it can provide a ton of nutrition in a diet. But depending on what kind you have, it might just be better off leaving it out because like getting raw dairy where I'm at, it is a headache. It is expensive as it is crazy expensive because the demand, I'm in St. Louis. There are people like me that want raw A2 milk. and the supply is so limited. And Bitcoin supply and demand, like this milk is like liquid gold. Like if you want to start a successful business, just go get some dairy cows, A2, and set up shop wherever. People, I mean, paying $20 a gallon for raw milk. So if anyone's interested in a business, come do that and increase our supply here a little bit, please.
Or anywhere, really.
All
I
right.
mean, especially in the U.S. I don't know about the laws everywhere else. I mean, it's hard to find anywhere like that I've traveled. Like it's difficult to find. So that's
It's illegal. It's a good
definitely
point.
a good business idea.
It's illegal in
But
many states, which is wild.
yeah,
So
crazy. And I think the word that you used there is a perfect encapsulation of just it's safe. It's not going to hurt you. You might have some negative reactions, like depending on the person. I think that is one area where different people have some variability in how they, take certain things. I think that's kind of the gray area one where I've heard some huge success stories. This girl on Instagram, I hope I'm not butchering her name, but Mia Pavsic or Pavsic,
mhm.
she had she went through a very difficult health time where she was, very underweight, and I'm sure she was plant based, and she was having a hard time getting nutrients in her body. And for her story revolved around raw milk. Like that was sort of the bridge to revitalizing her body with nutrients. So I think that for people that are in a situation where they're trying to gain weight, they're underweight, they want to gain, milk is definitely more interesting. My friend that I actually traveled with, he goes by Peruvian Bull on Twitter. Um, when we were in Colombia together, one of his main goals was to gain a lot of weight. He wanted to gain weight, so he was drinking a lot more milk. And I wasn't trying to gain weight. I was kind of just staying where I was. I was happy with this. And so I didn't touch the milk. But it really just depends on your goals. I would say if you're trying to lose weight, I
Exactly.
wouldn't recommend milk. But if you're trying to gain weight, it can be good. And I mean, it's full of nutrients for sure. It doesn't have all these negatives that we've been talking about of like the plant toxins and things like that because this is coming directly from an animal, and it's loaded with vitamins. So
Yeah.
and it was a great point that you mentioned too that I forgot to mention. Like, yeah, I wasn't drinking raw, so maybe that I should just throw that experiment out the window and just try again with real raw milk and see what happens.
It'd be an interesting experiment.
It's tricky when I'm traveling around all the places because you really got to make those connections where you are.
You
It's
do.
tough.
You do. I have a goat lady. I got my goat lady for the milk. One thing you mentioned was the safety, which I wanted to mention is raw milk really cannot be mass produced safely, and which is why we have the illegal laws that we have. Just because it can't be mass produced does not mean you should not consume it, because it does need to be. You need to have healthy cows, and it needs to be refrigerated. You got to do things right, or it could be risky. So you need to get high quality milk. The good thing is, like, if you're getting raw milk, you're going to be getting it from a local farmer, and hopefully, they're doing things properly, so it is safe and highly nutritious. Uh, the other thing I want to mention about milk, because it's only to be fair, you got to play both sides. Like devil's advocate is, as far as like an ancestral food, we've been drinking raw milk for thousands of years, but not tens of thousands of years. That is a product also of the agricultural revolution. So it's worth, to play devil's advocate. I don't think it's an ancestral food. And so the last 18 months, I've been drinking a lot of raw milk. But I plan to go after this bulk, going to more of what I would consider an ancestrally appropriate diet. I may incorporate some raw milk, but the quantity will be much less. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I've been doing it to gain weight. I think it can be super nutritious. It hasn't had any downsides for me, but I wouldn't recommend most people drinking 2 gallons of raw milk a week, which is like what I've been doing. I was even up to almost 3 gallons a week.
Gosh, wow, that's
It was a lot. I'm
yeah,
up
yeah,
35
that's good.
pounds.
So to wrap up this quick discussion, we're coming up to the end of our time here. I got two final questions for you. The first one is sort of just tying up the loose ends of the nuances we've been touching around. Um, I'm just going to give it to you straight up. What do you think is the optimal human diet for someone who isn't trying to do any crazy things with their weight? They just want to be as healthy as possible. What do you think is a perfect diet for them?
I would say we didn't talk about other meats like chicken and pork. Conventional chicken and pork are okay to incorporate some. It's a long discussion, but the fat quality tends to be less, not less desirable. So I would stick to ruminant meat. I mean, the ideal situation is you're eating ruminant meat, grass fed, grass finished. Not everyone can do that. So like ruminant meat that isn't conventional ruminant meat is like kind of like the next step. I would say, you know, pasture properly raised chicken and pork is kind of that level 2 as well. There's like a level 3 where it's like conventional chicken and pork, not ideal. I try and limit that. But I don't want to get too complicated because this is like a wrap up question. So I would focus on ruminant meat, like we were kind of talking about ruminant meat, properly raised eggs, pastured eggs. If you're going to include some dairy, I recommend like a high quality source dairy if you're going to do that. But like we talked about, probably most people are better off without that. I would say the proper kind of human diet is a hypercarnivore diet, where so 70% or more of your diet coming from high quality meat, which I would say would be for most people ruminant meat. And then if you're going to include some plant foods, I would stick with uh, seasonal local fruits and hopefully organic, less, not sprayed down with tons of glyphosate, things like that. Roots, but I would make sure like potatoes, sweet potatoes, but I would make sure to peel them and cook them if you're going to eat those. And I would make like the plant side of that 30% or less of your calories. I think if you're in those ballparks, you're doing pretty darn good.
If I was your patient right now and I said, "Sounds cool, Kevin, but I'm just going to eat 100% ground beef loaded with butter every day with salt," would you have a problem with that?
I would not have a problem with it, but I would just with the caveat that I would probably, 6 months down, 1 year into it, just make sure you're doing all right. Some people have certain various things where it's like, hey, maybe we need to include some eggs or some liver, or we need some folate in your diet. I know people have done just ground beef and some eggs for long periods of time. Totally fine. I did strict muscle meat only, like muscle meat only for basically 2 years, beef, and fantastic. That doesn't mean that's the ideal diet necessarily. But you can do just long, like you're getting your nutrients. So I wouldn't be super worried, and I would just keep an eye on these people that were going to do just ground beef. It's more thoroughly cooked, so you theoretically could get a little bit less vitamin content in your diet. So I might keep an eye on them, but I think they're going to be more or less do fantastic.
I haven't even explored the raw meat side of things, which I know some people are super into because,
Yeah.
like you said, it takes out less of the nutrients. Right now, I'm sticking with ground beef every night and I cook it on high heat, so it gets a little bit of crispy on the outside and a little bit of like raw on the inside, so it's like a nice mix.
Yeah.
Loving it. It's super good. But yeah,
So
and one of the go ahead.
I was just gonna say throughout my journey, like you, I'd not eaten like hardly any red meat in my diet, but 7 years ago or so, it's a long time ago when I started eating just meat. I was cooking it like medium well, and then after a year, it was rare, and then since then, it's like Pittsburgh rare. I just do a sear. I cook for 30 seconds, and I eat it like that. That's how I like it. So it's not like I was doing that to be like I want more vitamins. I was just like that's where my taste buds, my intuition took me down that route. So maybe yours will take you there too.
Yeah, we'll see. Because I'm definitely new to it, and we didn't even get into like the benefits of just like chewing for your
I know.
jaw. Because
Huge discussion.
that's something we can do on another episode down the road. I'd love to reconnect and talk about that one because that's something I have actually noticed change a lot when I started going to a meat-based diet. Is that like I have had the softest baby face my whole life, and for the first time ever, I'm starting to see like a jaw peek through from chewing all that steak. So a nice
That's
extra benefit that I'm looking forward to exploring more.
such an important topic.
And
It goes right with airway because I treat sleep apnea and things like that, and the jaw, the chewing, all that, and malocclusion, it's all related, and as well with sleep apnea.
excellent. Yeah, we'll keep that one for next time. I'd love to reconnect in the future. And just one of the things you said there would be a perfect final word is just like to try these things and just monitor yourself. Keep a journal. Like I think that it's a perfect time for people to really experiment with different types of diets than they're used to. And for most people out there, the carnivore diet sounds insane, or even just like a high meat diet. But I think if they try it out and they really listen to their body and give it a strong effort for 30 days or more, they'll notice that they could see some huge benefits in their teeth, their guts, or otherwise. Like like I was saying, my facial structure is literally changing from this, and everything's just getting better from my view. So worth everyone giving a try, looking into more info. Dr. Kevin Stock, we're coming up on our hour here. I really appreciate you coming by, my man. Do you have any final words?
Only final words would be, if someone's diving into the carnivore diet, get educated first. Meaning, the transition period can be rough for a lot of people. Know what you're getting into before you start, because at the end of week 1, you're probably going to throw in the towel if you just go into it blind. So there's tons of resources out there. I got a ton of resources, tons of free just ebooks galore. I got a big 90-day program, things like that. Not to promote that at all, but just education early on is like what I would harp more than anything.
I love that. And I know you got a website, meat.health. Shout
Yeah.
out to that. Anyone just looking for a place to start. I'm also building a website that's going to be sort of an educational resource website. So still in the works, but I think that education is key. And I'm really looking forward to this next year of just getting more people to at least start asking questions and thinking about it. So nothing but good times ahead, my man. Thank you so much for coming by. I appreciate
Thanks
it,
for having
Kevin.
me on.